Friday, the 6th of September, 2024. And I am going to talk to you about a topic that I don't usually talk about, although, well, yesterday I had somebody popping up questions about it and comments about it, and then there was another and another during the live stream. I don't know why, but they were asking about, or they were commenting about Palestine. They were asking and commenting. Okay. And usually these days when that kind of question or comment comes up, what ends up happening is the discussion, shifts into that mode, and people tend to be pretty siloed. And in some sense, that's logical. In many senses, it's not, especially for people who don't actually live in the region and may or may not understand the context or the history. Some do, but most don't. And it's like the people that go to protest one side or the other on college campuses. There's no shortage of reporting done to demonstrate that a huge portion of the people going to those demonstrations, probably even a majority, don't even know what they're protesting for. They just know it's cool to protest. And it's cool to join that protest. Why? Who said it's cool? It's cool to support terrorists? I don't think it's cool to support terrorists. But that's what they're doing when they're literally singing praises to Hamas, right? No, man, we want a free Palestine. Okay, if you want a free Palestine, the first thing you got to do is get rid of Hamas, right? And get rid of the Palestinian Authority, frankly, or at least the violent factions of the Palestinian Authority. Right? That's in the Judea and Samaria area, which those people typically refer to as the West Bank, but it is historically called Judea and Samaria. It's only been called the West Bank since about the last 56 years or so, once Israel took that land back during the 6-Day War. And I say back because historically, those lands, Judea and Samaria, are literally the lands that were historically part of the homeland of the Jewish people for thousands of years. And it's only in the last 120 years or so that Arabs moved there in significant numbers from Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Syria, Jordan, and Lebanon, mostly coming in to serve as mercenaries for the French and British colonial powers that had colonized the land that used to be controlled by the Turks, or the Ottomans at the time, they were called, right? The Governorate of Palestine. It was not a country. It's called the Governorate of Palestine. The land has never been a country called Palestine. Right? The word Palestine itself, as you should know, is literally a derivative of the Latin word for Philistine. Right? They called it Philistina as an insult to the Jews, to the Jewish people. Right? So the very name Palestine is intended to offend the Jewish people, but whatever. Putting that aside. Right? And if you know your Bible, then you know why that is, right? David and Goliath. Goliath was a Philistine. They were sworn enemies of the Jews. They're not the same as the Palestinian people at all. Okay? They were completely different people. They didn't exist. What people call themselves Palestinian now have literally no connection to those Philistines, right? But they took the name Palestinian, again, in order to culturally appropriate an insult against the Jews that the Romans had invented as an insult against the Jews when the Romans attacked and conquered and evacuated most Jews from Israel. Around the year 70, so around 2,000 years ago, or 1946 years ago. So, historical context is one side. What is the ugly situation of this war? And I said it from the beginning. Bibi should have resigned on October 7th, in my opinion. Do I think Israel should crush the Hamas and dismantle them and get all the soldiers and get all the hostages freed? Yes. Do I think these things can happen simultaneously? To some degree, yes. Do I think negotiations, whether we like it or not, with Hamas are practical and necessary in order to get the security, the secured release of most hostages or all of them? Yes, I do. Do I think it's acceptable to leave hostages behind? No, I don't. Do I think that getting Israel's hostages and all the other, all the hostages, whether they're American Israeli or just Israeli or Russian Israeli or whatever they are, any citizenship they have, do I think it's acceptable to leave any of them behind? No. Do I think we should get them all out? Yeah, I think the Western world should apply immense pressure onto Hamas, not just Israel, the entire Western world. But of course, they don't have the courage to do that. Right? Europe certainly doesn't have the courage to apply pressure to Hamas. Europe has surrendered itself. Europe is quickly becoming, I'm sad to say, but it's true, it's quickly becoming part of the Islamic Caliphate. And when the Hamas says Israel is the stepping stone and the rest of the world is next, that's exactly what they mean. They want to destroy Israel so that they can go on to destroy Europe and destroy America. And if you don't believe that, and by the way, they'll want to destroy Japan and China after that. They are not, they want the world. And Iran wants the same thing. Why? Because they have the same agenda. Right? They want a fundamentalist, extremist, Islamist world that is governed by Sharia law, where women don't have equal rights. They have no rights. They're treated like, worse than you would treat your own animals. Children basically don't have rights. Girls certainly don't have rights. The only people who have rights are men with power. That's it. It's the kind of world they live in. That's the kind of world they want. They don't believe in freedom of expression. They don't believe in freedom of religion. They don't believe in, if you're gay, you have the right to love whoever you want, all that stuff. No. Very strict Islamist fundamentalism, right? That's what Israel's up against. And people who are all those liberal things and too retarded to understand that, I say that, choosing that word very carefully because that's really relevant. People who are too dumb to understand, not because they're ignorant. At this point, if you're so involved in a thing, in a concept, in an issue, in a cause, but you don't know anything about it, after months of it happening, let alone the years or decades you might have been involved in it, if you're suddenly so passionate about something, even since a week, right? So your friend just turned you on to this idea a week ago, hey, let's go to the rally and protest for the Palestinians. If in that week you haven't learned anything about it, other than the dumb things you did or said at the rally, if you haven't Googled, about the Israel-Palestine conflict, right? The Arab-Israeli war, the state of Israel, right? Things like that. And I don't know what to tell you, you're willfully ignorant of the problems. But I will say, I'm not 100% gung-ho for what Israel is doing, in the sense that I am not for what the prime minister is doing. And he's the head of the Israeli government. In what way? I'm against this notion that keeping a tract of land called the Philadelphia Corridor is more important than negotiating the release of the hostages. He has said, allegedly, that keeping the corridor is more important than getting the hostages out. Really, I wonder how he'd feel if the shoe was on the other foot. What if he was held captive? Would he hope that they would come and rescue him in a negotiated deal, or that they would keep a tract of dirt that the army and the entire security establishment of Israel says that they can get control of at any time they want. And which, by the way, Israel has not taken until 2 months ago. Which means Israel didn't think, like the government of Israel, the prime minister of Israel, did not think it was a priority to take that little tiny strip of road, which they easily could have taken during the first 8 months of the war, but they didn't. They only took it during the last few months, like May or June. Why? And everyone's like, oh, if Israel leaves the corridor, the Hamas is going to move terrorists, is going to move smugglers and terrorists through it. What do you think they did there in the first 8 months? Why didn't they move hostages through there in the first 8 months? Why are they going to suddenly do it now if Israel leaves? And you don't know that they didn't, by the way. There might be no more hostages left in Gaza. It's improbable, but they might have at least moved some, right? Sinwar might have left Gaza. We don't know, right? We don't know for sure. So to say that that little tiny strip of dirt is somehow more important than getting people back, whether they're alive or dead, hopefully they're all alive, but we know they're not, is an offense to everything that Israeli values normally are when it comes to dealing with hostages, and hostage takers. Normally, this country, Israel, has a strong record, an impressive record of doing everything that it can, going to great lengths to get its hostages home. But in recent decades, unfortunately, it has allowed hostage situations to languish for too long. Gilad Shalit was held by the Hamas for years before he was eventually released in a deal that included releasing 1,000 Palestinian terrorists from Israeli prisons, including Mr. Sinwar, the guy who headed the attack of October 7th, and who is the military head of Hamas and who's now also the political head of Hamas. And he, by the way, received medical attention in an Israeli hospital at the hands of Israeli doctors, who literally saved his life, like brain surgery. And he went back to Gaza after being released from prison with 1,000 other Palestinians in exchange for Gilad Shalit, one person. And Hamas, by the way, still holds 2 other hostages since like 2014 and 2015. So since a very long time, it's been holding people, and Israel basically forgot about them. And who knows if they're even alive? But these 2 people have been held by Hamas since 10 years, 9 years now. And it is extremely offensive that Israel has done nothing to get them out. Nothing. It's offensive to those families of those who are being held captive. As I said from the beginning of this war is not going to end the way people think it is because of the propaganda being spread and the lies being told by the prime minister. Right? When he said on October 7th that Israel did not know in advance that this attack was going to happen, it was a total surprise attack, I said right then and there, while he was speaking on TV, live, I said, you knew, you're lying. You knew. I said, he did this on purpose, and he did it on purpose for his political gains. And I was right. He did it for his political interests. He knew. The evidence has borne itself out significantly ever since the early days of this war. And he knew. And he should resign. But we find ourselves in a situation where, look, whether I like him or not is not the point. He didn't actually launch the attacks. He knew, and he should resign for that, and he should pay a heavy price for that. But at the same time, the people who are ultimately responsible for starting this stupid war, and all war is stupid, that's why I call it that, the Hamas, right? Hamas started this ugly war. They're responsible for it, nobody else, in terms of who actually started it. They're the ones who took the hostages. They're the ones who killed and did all the terrible things that they did on October 7th. If it wasn't for that attack, we would not be in a world that has this war going on right now. Israel would be in a much better situation, and so would Gaza. But the Hamas does not want Israel to have peace with the Saudi Arabians, because then they know that would immensely diminish Hamas's influence and Iran's interest, and ultimately they answer to Iran. And Iran does not want to lose the influence that it thinks it has in the region. So they would do anything to not lose that, including start a war with Israel, which they know is insane, and which they know they cannot win kinetically. Best they can hope to do is to win the war of public opinion. Right? They're not going to win the war of physics, but they're not trying to win the war of physics. They're trying to win the war of by the Hamas people is that they would attack a few places. If they had great success, they would, from their perspective, they would manage to take a few people from some of the places, maybe get a dozen or 20 people captive, which is a huge amount relative to how many people have been caught by them in the recent decades. Usually it's one at a time or two at a time. Usually one's dead, right? Or two bodies and a living person, something like that. They're not usually capturing a lot of Israel. The biggest single prior to October was the hijacking of the Air France plane from, which flew out of Ben Gurion Airport in Israel, was captured by German terrorists aboard the flight. German terrorists who sympathized with the Palestinian, the PLO, and diverted the plane to Uganda, to the airport at Entebbe, where the dictator Idi Amin Dada was the ruler, to fly airplanes by the Israeli Air Force. And as I was saying, and the airport at Entebbe was designed and built essentially as a clone of the Israeli airport, the David Ben Gurion Airport in Israel, the major international airport in Israel. It was designed and built by the same people that designed and built the one in Israel. They built an airplane, a clone of it, in Uganda for the Ugandan people. And the thank you that Israel got for doing these things for Uganda and for its horrifying dictator who used to, among other things, feed people to crocodiles, usually political opponents. The thank you that Israel got was that these Palestinian terrorists were able to land their plane full of Israelis and Jews and people of all walks of life, the Air France plane, in Uganda. And basically, those terrorists were able to get the assistance of the Ugandan military to keep those people in the airport as a place to hold them while they negotiated with Israel in order to get their demands met, which of course were insane demands, to release prisoners and do all kinds of things. But back in the 70s was not how Israel handled terrorism situations, right? Israel had a special forces unit, and they still do, which is designed to go and rescue hostages. And they have multiple units that do that. And in 1976, Israel sent in the Sayeret Matkal, or Sayeret Matkal, if you pronounce it the way some Israelis, the way Hebrew is normally spoken, with the resh sound for the R. And they are basically an elite unit of the IDF. And Delta Force or whatever you want to call them. They go to foreign locations to do incredibly risky and dangerous operations. And that was one of them. And the leader of that particular mission was an Israeli officer named Yonatan Netanyahu, or Yoni Netanyahu. He was the brother of the current prime minister, and he was the only Israeli soldier who died during that operation. There was an Israeli, and there was a woman who was a hostage who had been taken to the hospital because she was very ill. She died in the hospital. Died during the rescue out of hundreds. So the mission, even though there were a small number of deaths, there's still death. And obviously the death of Yonatan and his view of how you combat terrorists and terrorism and to what lengths Israel as a right significant political leader to eventually he's been in his education and his knowledge, but he also deserves criticism. Now don't get it twisted. Don't think that I just hate Bibi and I hate Israel. I don't. I love Israel. And I don't even hate Bibi, but I hate what Bibi did, ignoring the dangers of October 7th. I think he should pay the price politically, and I don't think he should ever be prime minister again. I think he should leave the office. And if he has other legal issues he has to contend with, then that has to play itself out in court. And he's got good lawyers who can defend him as well as any prime minister can be defended. So I'm not worried for his ability to have a good defense. There are people in the world who don't have a good access to good legal representation, and that's not right. But he does have that. I'm not concerned that he doesn't have that. Right? But I don't think that he should be the head of the government who basically is continuing this conflict for political purposes. As long as it goes on, it serves his interests. He knows that, and he's taking advantage of that. The longer this goes on, the longer the prisoners are allowed to be, the hostages are allowed to be kept by their torturers, their captors, the longer the psychological torture is on them and on their families and on the entire state of Israel and anybody who supports Israel. And all in all, it is just a gross and disgusting situation. At the same time, again, I don't blame the entire war just on Bibi, even though he wants to keep it going. That's clear. The person that I blame this on, beyond the Iranian ayatollahs and mullahs, is actually Yahya Sinwar. Right? He's the head of the Hamas. He was the military head when this thing was launched. He's the political head of this organization now because the former political head is dead. He died in Iran, right, at the funeral or something of the previous president who died in a sudden helicopter accident earlier in the year. Right? So I don't think that it would be right to just blame Bibi without saying very clearly that Yahya Sinwar is responsible for this war. If he wanted this war to end, he would make this war end. I mean, it's very, very obvious. Right? We all know what has to happen. The Nazis surrendered. The Imperial Japanese Army surrendered. Throughout history, losing armies surrender. This is not unusual. What is unusual is that armies or armed forces, even terrorist groups, refuse to surrender and somehow force nations to accept a ceasefire instead of just destroying those terrorist forces, completely wiping them out, every last single person in the organization, which Israel certainly has the kinetic capability to do. Why they don't is because of international pressure, which is ridiculous. At the same time, I understand why families of the hostages want the Israeli government or the American government or whatever government to do whatever they can to pressure Hamas to releasing the hostages, including diplomatic pressure, negotiations, whatever it might be. They're families of hostages. If you had a family member who was taken hostage, would you be one of those people who's saying, nah, just keep pressing and shooting at the Hamas? Because, we know that the Hamas kills the hostages when you get close to freeing them, but go ahead, just keep shooting at them. Maybe, the universe will protect my loved ones. And I don't worry about it. Or would you want them to negotiate the release of your loved one? Be real. Most people would want to negotiate the release. And the thing about that is that there's a lot of people who are very pro-Israel, and I'm very pro-Israel in many ways, but I'm not pro putting the lives of hostages at risk just because of some zealot or some zealous feeling, like zealotry. That's nonsense. Get the people free. And then if these people, and if that leads to a ceasefire, great. The moment the ceasefire is broken in any way, do what has to be done. But don't allow people to languish in captivity just because political reasons or emotions, or you think it's right, or it's a black and white issue. It's not a black and white issue to the hostages being held and abused by the Hamas. It's not a black and white issue to their families. It's if anything, if the black and white issue is, get the hostages free. That's the black and white issue. If you're very Jewish and you believe in the values of Judaism, freeing hostages is more important than continuing to prosecute a war that Israel has, by definition, already won in terms of kinetics. Israel has destroyed an enormous amount of Hamas. By the way, collateral damage, it's also destroyed a huge part of Gaza, which Israel and a lot of other countries are now going to have to repay to rebuild. And those other countries don't even have to. And Israel technically doesn't have to, but it will, because it destroyed it. But normally the loser has to build their own country up again in history. Nope, not in the case of Israel and the Arabs. Israel has to do all the paying and all the rebuilding and everything else. And why? Well, because there are tremendous hypocrisies in the Middle East. What are you saying here? What? English or Spanish? Do I sound Spanish to you? I'm not Spanish. I might have a Spanish name. Maybe. Or maybe a different name. But no, I'm not Spanish. I did work in places where I had to know some Spanish. If that's of any interest. And so it is immensely disappointing that Israel has to remain entangled in this war with Hamas because Hamas won't do the decent thing. But we're talking about a group of terrorists. Did you expect terrorists to do the decent thing? If they did the decent thing, they wouldn't have taken hostages in the first place. Their goal is not to make peace with Israel. Their goal is to literally kill every Jew in the world, starting with the ones in Israel, kill every other Israeli in the world, starting with the ones in Israel, and not just Jewish ones. every Israeli, including Arabs, including Druze, including Samaritans, including Christians, including you name it, Israelis, atheists, doesn't matter. They want to kill them all. And then they want to destroy Israel. And once they're done destroying Israel, they want to turn that land into part of the Islamist, fundamentalist, extreme caliphate. And then they want to proceed to do the same thing over and over again throughout Europe, where they already have 20% or more of the population, in certain countries up to 40%. And, of people that they've migrated to Europe who can easily be subject to their caliphate rules if suddenly they decide to launch a massive war, which in theory they could do if they manage to take over Israel. Like, you got to realize, if you live in the West, Israel is literally your shield. It is literally protecting you from the slings and arrows coming out of the Middle East. You may not like to hear it. You may not like to admit it. Maybe you're one of these people who likes the fact that the Muslims are going to take over and is going to treat women like crap and is going to take away, their freedoms and rights of people in Europe. Maybe you like that. Most people don't. At least not people who live, in the world and who want to have, rights. So, the way I see it, don't get the facts twisted. Don't fall for the nonsense. There's a lot of nonsense. Don't fall for it. It'd be a shame. Anyway, let me get going and bid you all peace. I didn't talk about crypto or markets or marketing or anything like that today. Just wanted to say this. I don't think. You could talk forever about this topic. It would be better to talk than to fight. I don't think it's right to say either side is perfect, but I certainly don't put the blame of starting the war on Israel, even if continuing the war is something that is in the interest of both the Hamas and the Prime Minister of Israel, not of Israel, but the Prime Minister of Israel, and the Hamas and its leadership, specifically Mr. Sinwar, who reportedly is hiding dressed as a woman in Gaza because he's afraid of Israel finding him and destroying him. Well, if that's really what you think, what makes you think he's even in Gaza? How do you know he hasn't left through the tunnels that Israel didn't control for 8 months? Again, the argument that Israel needs to control this tunnel network underneath the Philadelphia corridor, and I agree, it should destroy the tunnels, and Egypt should be held at least partially responsible for allowing these tunnels to exist every couple hundred meters. It's not like they were hard to find. You could drive trucks through them, for God's sake, in many cases. Trucks. And they were every couple hundred meters. So there was obviously massive construction going along the entire border the whole time. And why Israel didn't point these things out to Egypt specifically, with the satellite photos that they have and recordings showing construction, right? They don't want to tell you that, but Israel has satellites. What do you think they have satellites for? To look at the Caribbean? Or maybe to look at their own borders? Why do we have spy satellites? To look at Iran. Great. Don't we look at our own borders? Doesn't Israel look at its own borders? Don't the Americans have spy satellites to look at? Don't we Americans have border monitoring satellites? We do. We monitor the border with Mexico. We monitor the border with Canada. You don't think Israel monitors the border with Gaza and with Egypt, just as it does with the rest of all of its other neighbors? Syria, Lebanon? No? Really? So if Israel knew that these tunnels existed and knew where they were, at least the vast majority of them, and was able to recapture this entire strip of land called the Philadelphia Corridor, why didn't it take it for the first 8 months if it was so critical? Why did they just leave it in the hands of the Hamas? Were they just not concerned that the hostages would be taken out during the first, 80% of the duration of the war so far? It's deeply offensive. It's now literally, now we're the 6th of September. We're now like 11 months since this thing started on October 7th. 11 months. So now it's been 3 months roughly since Israel's had control of the Philadelphia Corridor. Again, for the first 8 months, they did not. And they did not prioritize taking control of it. Even though everyone who knew anything about security said take control, shut it down. Prime Minister didn't do it because he wanted to keep the war going on, so he knew that would keep the war going on. And now he refuses to leave because he knows that leaving that corridor would remove the last objection that the Hamas has to stopping the war. Convenient, huh? So I find it deeply offensive that the head of the Hamas is as barbaric as he is. And when I say barbaric, I'm sorry to all the people who actually know barbarian culture and realize not all of it was as it is presented. But it is a coin, it is an expression, right? Because barbarians were actually a much finer and more sophisticated culture in many ways than like the Hamas culture, right? Barbarians were actually incredibly crafty people who made beautiful art and had an incredible culture in many ways. And they were called barbarians as an insult. The same way people in the 80s in America, for example, used to oftentimes joke about Polish people, pretending that they were dumb. The Polish people aren't particularly dumber or smarter than anyone else. They're people. And many of them are quite brilliant, just like any population. And some people are dumb, just like any population. And most of them are average, just like any population. But that's the stereotype, right? We lived much more in a world of stereotypes in that time. Anyway, I mentioned these things to you, partly to get them off my chest and to express myself about this insane war, this dumb war. Because again, that's what it is. War is dumb. There's no intelligent reason to have war. Right? There are reasons to have to defend yourselves, but there's no reason to start a war, to aggressively start a war without cause. There's no reason for that. When you attack somebody, they're going to defend themselves, and that can cause war to be long. But to just be aggressive and start a war against somebody because you want their things or you just hate them, that's insane. Who do I blame for that? I blame the Hamas. Let's be clear. I don't blame Israel for starting this war. Do I think Israel can do more to end this war and get the hostages free and keep the Hamas in check? And if they do even one thing to violate the ceasefire, to completely just go after them? Yeah, I do. But I don't think that the current political context is going to make Israeli political leaders make those demands and do those things. Unfortunately, because of the state of the world of American politics, European politics, individual European nations politics, UK politics, which is sort of European and but mostly really not because they're not part of the EU technically. But they're They're not American. And they're similar to Europe in many ways, especially now. And Israeli politics and Palestinian politics and Iranian politics and Qatari politics and Saudi politics and Jordanian politics and Syrian politics and Lebanese politics and Hezbollah politics. There's a lot of politics involved in this conflict. You got South Africans who enjoin themselves to the issue for some reason. You realize there's more than 100 peoples at war right now on planet Earth? More than 100. There's more than 50 wars happening right now. Wars, conflicts, major conflicts happening right now. Do you realize that? On this planet, there are more than 100 peoples, meaning there are 50 conflicts involving two sides happening right now that involve significant violence. Can you name even 10 of them? I'd be surprised if you could. Granted, they're not all wars between major powers or their proxies, but there are more than 100 peoples fighting for survival right now, or fighting wars of one kind or another right now. By the way, there typically are. That's a number that's like, it doesn't change much from year to year. Yeah, some conflicts ends and new ones arise. But there are typically about 100 people groups at war. And you could say, yeah, well, most of them are small tribal conflicts. Dude, the war in the Middle East is a tribal conflict. The war of oppression in China against the Uyghurs is a tribal conflict. The fact that the Uyghurs don't have any way to defend themselves doesn't mean it's not a war. The war in Tibet, of what the Chinese have done to Tibet, it's a tribal conflict. It doesn't mean that just because the Tibetan people don't have weapons, that it's not a war. Do you even know what's happening in Sudan and South Sudan? Do you even know? Do you even know what's happening in Syria, which is right next to Israel, or in Lebanon, which is right next to Israel? And I don't mean about the Hezbollah. Do you even know what's happening in Lebanon with their other conflicts? Because yes, they have other conflicts there. Do you know what's happening in Syria and Turkey? These are countries like right next to or real close to Israel, right? Turkey's real close to Israel. Turkey's technically an ally of Israel. They got conflicts internally since decades. Do you even know what they are? Without Googling it. Do you know if Turkey, which is a NATO member, ostensibly an ally of the United States and all other NATO members, do you know if Turkey, this should be kind of an obvious answer, is Turkey pro-ISIS or anti-ISIS? Like when America was fighting ISIS, right, the offshoot of Al-Qaeda and all those crazy terrorist groups, the Islamic State in, the Middle East. Basically, Hamas, a version of Hamas, right? Crazy fundamentalist extremists who want to take over the Middle East and turn it into a caliphate. Do you even know which party in that conflict does Turkey back? Do they back the pro-ISIS group that America and NATO forces were fighting against? Keeping in mind Turkey is a NATO member. Or were they backing another group? I'll clue you in. In that particular case, if you don't know the answer, yeah, Turkey was backing ISIS. in its conflict with Syria. Yeah, put that in your pipe and smoke it. Turkey, a NATO member, was backing ISIS with F-16s made in America, and tanks made in America, and guns made in America. Directly funding a terrorist group that wants to destroy America, and directly backing that terrorist group with weapons made in America. So much for an ally, right? But you probably don't even know that, right? If you're the average person. And I got nothing against the average person. I'm just saying that most people don't know about conflicts in different regions of the world because they don't study international relations and politics and war and all that stuff. They don't got time for that. That's not what they do for a living. That's not what they do. That's not what they studied in school. So I get it. I don't expect you to know all these things. But if you don't know these things, before you go to some rally and talk trash about one side or the other, maybe learn a thing about it. Maybe get educated about it. Maybe read a primer. Read some books about it. Some good authoritative books about it, not trash. Most of the stuff coming out these days is trash. Read some good historical information about it. Take a proper class on it. You can learn online. In most cases, you can do these classes for free. Do it because you say you care. If you want the war to end, you got to know about it so that you can help it end. It's never going to end if you don't make an effort to make it end. It's not going to happen. Okay. You want a war to end, you got to make an effort. Don't make an effort, it ain't going to end. It's really that simple. All right. I've said enough for now. I wish you all well, and peace.